In the winter of 2001, a hunter named Jonah Iqaluk left Rankin Inlet before sunrise. He carried fuel food and an oilcloth map folded twice in his pack. By evening, his snowmobile was found upright on the ice, its engine still warm, the key gone. No prints, no trail, no Jonah. Searchers combed the inlet for weeks, pulling grids across the white horizon, finding only fragments, a torn glove, a scorched knife. The case was logged as unsolved, buried under years of silence. Yet, 2 decades later, a sealed RCMP photograph surfaced, showing Jonah with a man no one could name. In the corner of the frame was the same oilcloth map unfolded across the snow. What began as a missing hunter's story was never just about the weather. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when Jonah Iqaluk readied his snowmobile outside the low-roofed house in Rankin Inlet. It was late February of 2001, the kind of morning where the air itself bit like iron. Neighbors saw him load the sled with fuel cans, a bundled harpoon, and a canvas bag of food. One more detail slipped almost without notice was an oilcloth map folded once pressed deep into the pack, as if it was meant to stay close at hand. Jonah's sister Lena stood at the door, her parka pulled tight, watching him prepare. He raised a gloved hand in a brief wave before he rode off across the frozen bay. By mid-morning, the winds began to shift. Weather bulletins on local radio warned of narrowing windows of visibility, but hunters lived by those margins. Jonah had gone out on similar days before. He had a reputation for endurance, for knowing the ice by the sound it made beneath his boots. His plan was ordinary, a seal hunt, no more than a day-out return before dusk. The kind of routine expedition that kept families fed and traditions unbroken. By 6 p.m. he had not returned. At first, no one panicked. Sometimes hunters stayed the night, if weather turned, or if they tracked seals beyond the expected grounds. But when another 2 hours passed, and the bay darkened under a band of violet sky, the settlement's unease grew sharp. Lena alerted the RCMP detachment, and Constable Mark Harland began making calls to volunteers. Snow machines were warmed, radios checked. Searchers knew too well that the cold did not forgive long delays. They found his machine the next morning, just past 8 a.m. 18 miles from Rankin Inlet, the snowmobile sat upright on a stretch of flat, frozen inlet. Its sled still clipped behind. The engine housing was crusted with frost, but when Harlan brushed the surface, a pocket of residual warmth clung beneath the cover. Logs later confirmed the engine had been shut down deliberately not long before it was discovered. The key was gone from the ignition. Around it, there were no tracks. A recent overnight wind had swept the surface clear, erasing anything that might have marked direction or struggle. Searchers circled outward, cutting wide arcs into the snow. But the horizon only gave them white upon white, the occasional ridge breaking the monotony like frozen scars. Inside the sled was a canvas bag of food unopened. A harpoon rested across it, untouched. Jonah had carried enough fuel to go much further, yet every can was still strapped in place. What was missing, Lena noticed almost at once, was the map. She remembered watching him tuck it into his pack that morning. Now the pack was open, and the oilcloth was nowhere to be seen. The search escalated. Volunteers marked the snowmobile's position on their own maps, drawing a circle, 18 miles wide, planning grids outward. Helicopters were called in their rotors, drumming heavy shadows across the snowfields. Peter Kajak, an elder hunter, joined them, tracing the air with a gloved finger, muttering about currents beneath the ice, about leads that could open without warning. Yet the surface around Jonah's machine was solid, unbroken. Harlan noted every detail into his logbook, the position, the engine's warmth, the absent key, the missing map. These fragments did not align. If Jonah had broken through the ice, the snowmobile should have been left tilted or abandoned far closer to a fault line. If he had chosen to walk, why leave everything? Food, fuel, weapons behind. It was the silence of the scene that chilled the searchers most. Machines abandoned on the land usually spoke through their scatter of gear, their last traces of urgency. Jonah's machine stood orderly, as though waiting for its owner to return. Lena stayed near the site longer than the rest, her breath streaming in short bursts, her eyes fixed on the snowmobile's seat. She brushed at the frost there, then stopped, realizing she was searching for heat that could no longer remain. Later, she told Harland it felt like standing beside a door that had closed, but not locked, as if Jonah might step out from the white at any moment. By nightfall, teams retreated, leaving the snowmobile marked with a red flag that fluttered against the icy dusk. The inlet lay silent again, save for the crack of distant wind. Beneath the snowmobile's frame, where shadow met ice, the missing key became the first question none of them could answer. The machine waited upright and perfect, its seat dusted in frost, its ignition empty. Snowmobile upright key missing from the ignition. The following morning began with a brittle sky, clear but sharp, the kind of light that exposes everything except what matters. By 9 a.m., searchers rode out again, their snowmobiles stringing across the inlet in staggered formation. Constable Harlan led the first wave, followed by 6 volunteers from town. Behind them, Lena clung to her machine jaw tight, refusing to be left behind. No one argued. She carried the same determination her brother had, a stubbornness that cut through weather as much as words. The inlet stretched featureless. Searchers laid grids marking with willow branches pressed into the snow. They kept radios open, each voice crackling into the other's headsets. Helicopter crews joined by late morning, their shadows sweeping across the expanse, searching for irregularities. Dark cracks, clusters of stones, shapes that did not belong. The bay gave little, only silence. It was Peter Kajak, riding behind the rest, who first noticed the faint drag in the snow. Barely visible, a shallow mark extending from where Jonah's snowmobile had been left. The line pulled toward the southeast, ending at the jagged edge of ice. Searchers dismounted, crouched, studied it. No boot prints on either side, just the soft impression of something heavy drawn outward. At the edge, the ice had fractured into plates, tilted and refrozen in a loose scatter. But no stain, no blood, no trace of Jonah. The cold had already reclaimed its surface. Forensics later noted the drag as inconsistent with Jonah's sled, which remained intact behind the snowmobile. Whatever had made it was narrower, lighter, its endpoint concealed by shifting flows. Searchers tested the edges with poles, wary of collapse. The ice held. It was as if the mark had been drawn for them, then erased by the next hand of wind. Back at the snowmobile site, Lena searched again through the canvas bag, fingers clumsy in the cold. She pulled out bundled food clothing and finally folded beneath a sweater the missing oilcloth map. Her breath caught. The map had not been lost on the ice after all. Yet when she spread it open against the snowmobile's sled, she saw new markings, one circle in pencil, heavy, deliberate, over a small unnamed island farther east. Jonah's hand was unmistakable. The graphite still sharp, as though drawn the same morning he vanished. Searchers gathered around, heads bent. Harlan logged the detail circle on oilcloth map, coordinates approximate. He looked at Lena, who pressed her gloved hand against the mark as if to claim it. Her eyes did not lift. That circle became their next destination. By early afternoon, machines pushed east. The terrain hardened into ridges and scoured valleys of snow. Each mile carried them further from the settlement, closer to silence, broken only by engines. They reached the island by 4 p.m. What they found was little more than a low rise in the ice, scattered with ancient rings of stone. Tent rings, Peter Kajak called them, remnants from older hunting camps long abandoned. Searchers walked through them, the stones half sunk in frost, circling emptiness. No Jonah, no new tracks, only the wind curling fine snow through the gaps. Helicopter crew circled overhead, reporting nothing but clean ice in every direction. The map had pointed them here, but it gave no explanation why. Harlan folded the oilcloth himself, returned it to Lena. "We'll log it," he told her. She only nodded, slipping it back into her coat. The map felt heavier now, as if carrying more than one man's absence. By evening, they set camp nearby, firelight flickering against snow ridges. Stories whispered between volunteers about other hunters who had vanished about the ice's way of swallowing men whole. Yet the map pressed against Lena's chest suggested otherwise. Jonah had marked something here, what no one could say. Searchers drifted to uneasy sleep, the stones of the old tent rings watching like unblinking eyes. Morning came, but answers did not. The circle remained dark and inexplicable, the only sign Jonah left them. Circle on the map, dark with Jonah's heavy hand. The third day of the search began with wind rising off the bay, sharp enough to strip warmth from skin in seconds. Searchers tightened hoods and checked fuel, but their voices carried a weariness already. The island that Jonah had circled gave them nothing but stones and silence. Still, they spread out in widening arcs, scouring for any trace. Helicopters passed overhead again, scanning the ridges, while, on the ground, men prodded snowbanks with poles, listening for the hollow echo of air beneath. They found no shelter, no tracks, not even discarded gear. The island was bare. Harlan logged the GPS coordinates of the tent rings, marking them in his book, but noted no evidence of recent human activity. To him, it looked like a dead end. To Lena, it felt like something Jonah had wanted them to see, though she could not explain why. By mid-afternoon, the wind became a low roar, rolling curtains of snow across the horizon. Volunteers argued about how long they could safely continue. Peter Kajak stood apart, gazing over the frozen channel beyond. He muttered about the way the ice shifted differently here, the deeper currents below. His words carried memory more than science, yet the others listened. For many, his knowledge of the land was older than any logbook. As they prepared to pull back, Lena spoke quietly to Harlan. She remembered Jonah's mood in the weeks before he vanished, an argument at a council meeting, words exchanged with Samuel Kigvik about disputed hunting quotas. Jonah had returned home that night, silent pacing, folding and unfolding his map on the table. He thought something was wrong, Lena said. Not just with the ice, with people. Harlan jotted the note, but his face gave nothing. Evening fell early. Searchers returned to town to restock fuel. Around kitchen tables, rumors began to build. Some recalled how Jonah's father had quarreled years earlier with families from the next inlet over disputes that never truly closed. Others whispered Jonah might have been drawn into those old tensions, unwillingly carrying forward a shadow of conflict. But in the official notes, his disappearance remained linked to environment, weather, ice, chance. That night, Lena unrolled the oilcloth map in her own house. Candlelight fell across its creases. The penciled circle was darker now from the pressure of her gloves smudged where snow had melted onto it. She traced the line of coast missing from the map's edge. Strange, she realized that Jonah's copy had no markings of settlements there. It was as if he had scraped them away, leaving the space empty. She pressed the fold closed, slid the map back into her pocket, and sat listening to the wind. Beyond her walls, the inlet stretched silent. The island lay deserted, its ancient rings of stone cut stark against the snow. They seemed like mouths half open, waiting for voices that would never return. An empty tent ring, stones like teeth in the snow. Snow fell in long, dry sheets the next morning, drifting over the inlet until horizon and ground blurred into one. The RCMP command post was moved into a canvas tent near the shoreline, a heater humming low against the bitter cold. Maps were tacked to plywood boards, red grease pencil lines marking search sectors, arrows pointing to the island Jonah had circled. Harlan briefed the teams with clipped sentences reminding them fuel reserves were dropping fast. Helicopter sorties cost hours of preparation, and already the town was straining to keep machines in the air. By noon, the air thundered as a Bell 212 lifted its crew, scanning with mounted camera. From above the inlet was a sheet of white broken by ridges of pale blue, no more detail than scars on bone. They searched wide, pushing further south until the camera operator caught a flash of dark, embedded in the snow near a pressure ridge. Coordinates were relayed, and Harlan's ground team moved toward it. What they found looked like nothing at first, just a lump half frozen into the ice. When pulled free, it revealed itself as a glove, dark brown leather, stiff with frost. The glove was torn at the palm threads, sticking like frozen veins. But the detail that shook Harlan was size. It was small, far too small for Jonah's wide hands. When shown to Lena, she shook her head immediately. "Not his," she said. "He never wore gloves like that." The glove was log-bagged and laid on the table in the command tent that evening. Under the weak light, its torn palm looked almost deliberate, as if someone had cut into it. But there was no blood, no heat signature, only the frozen stiffness of something abandoned long before. Harlan wrote into the logbook, "One glove recovered ridge sector, east dimensions, inconsistent with subject." Then he closed the book and rubbed at his eyes. The discovery sharpened whispers that were already rising. Rivalries, grudges, the memory of arguments Jonah had with Samuel Kigvik about hunting grounds. Samuel had been seen on the ice the week before traveling with his own sled toward disputed territory. He told interviewers he had returned home early that day, storm warnings pushing him back. No witness confirmed it. Volunteers repeated his name more than once around campfires, the sound carried low like a secret. Lena sat apart from those talks, unfolding Jonah's map again. She spread it across the command tent's table beside the glove. Dark stains of grease smeared its edges from Jonah's own hands, the folds stiffened from cold. She stared at the circle he had drawn, then at the coordinates of the glove, and found they did not align. The glove had been found far east, almost beyond the range Jonah would have traveled on a single day's fuel. Yet there it was, logged under his search. Peter Kajak leaned over her shoulder, tapping the circle with a thick finger. "He wanted you to look there," the elder said softly. "Not here." His eyes flicked toward the glove lying stiff under plastic. Things on the ice don't always belong where we find them. As darkness fell, the tent filled with the groan of wind against canvas. The glove rested under lamplight, its torn palm facing upward, frozen mid-gesture. It seemed to wait for a hand that would never slide back inside. The glove frozen mid-wave beneath the ice crust. By the fifth day, the search had shifted from pure rescue into something more probing, more suspicious. The snowmobile, the circle on the map, the glove that clearly belonged to someone else, all of it pulled the search away from weather and into questions of motive. RCMP interviews began at dawn. Harlan moved from house to house in Rankin Inlet, recording statements, his notebook thick with cramped handwriting. He asked about Jonah's recent routes, about arguments, about anyone who might have followed him onto the ice. Samuel Kigvik's name surfaced again and again. He was a seasoned hunter, a man who prided himself on old roots passed down from his father. Weeks earlier, he and Jonah had clashed in front of council members about seal quotas. Words had risen, sharp accusations that Jonah was pushing into waters that were not his. Samuel had walked out of the meeting without waiting for a resolution. When Harlan sat across from him now, Samuel's answers were flat, his hands folded. He claimed he had gone out that morning, but returned when the wind shifted. His wife nodded in confirmation, but no other witness placed him at home before nightfall. The tension thickened among searchers. Some argued Jonah must have lost his way, that the glove was coincidence carried by shifting snow. Others insisted the evidence pointed toward something darker. In the absence of Jonah's body, every fragment became a seed for speculation. That afternoon, helicopter crews flew another pass, extending their grid east of the inlet. From the air, a camera caught a strange line in the snow, long and unnaturally straight. It stretched across more than 200 yards, then ended abruptly, as though whatever had drawn it had simply lifted away. Ground teams rode out, marked the coordinates, and walked the length of it. The line looked like a drag, narrower than a sled, deeper than a footprint. No items were found along it, no explanation at either end. The snow gave no more than that stark incision. In the command tent, Lena traced the shape onto Jonah's oilcloth map, sketching carefully over his penciled circle. The straight line cut close, as though connecting to his mark, then veering off into nothing. She stared at it for long minutes, the pencil trembling in her grip. The map was becoming a layered palimpsest of marks. Jonah's heavy circle, her own copied lines, the creases where his hands had folded it again and again. Night fell, early pressing shadows against the tent. Searchers spoke in low tones, wondering if the line was natural, a trick of drifting ice, or evidence of someone dragging a burden too heavy to carry. No one could say. But the silence of it pressed against their thoughts, a trail that began with certainty and ended with blankness. Lena folded the map and held it close, as though the paper itself might carry Jonah's last intention. Around her, men shifted uneasily, their eyes still picturing the endless line in the snow disappearing into perfect white, a trail vanishing into perfect white nothing. The storm passed in the night, leaving the inlet scraped clean by wind. The morning light fell harsh and brittle, throwing long shadows across the ice ridges. Searchers assembled again, their machines lined in rows like patient horses. Fuel was running thin, but no one admitted it aloud. Every mile meant weighing how much longer they could keep the operation alive. Still, they pushed forward because silence was heavier than exhaustion. Harlan called for a return to the island Jonah had circled. If nothing else, he argued it was the only point Jonah himself had marked. The team rode east in staggered lines, engines thrumming against the cold. Lena rode in the center, the oilcloth map folded inside her parka. She had begun to treat it less as a tool and more as something sacred, an object tethering her to Jonah. Each time she unfolded it, the creases grew more fragile, the smudged pencil circles spreading faintly like a bruise. On the island, the stones of the ancient tent rings jutted through new drifts. Searchers spread across the ridges, probing with poles, combing for any scrap. Hours passed before one volunteer called out from a shallow depression. Beneath a thin crust of ice lay the imprint of a boot. Unlike the faint lines they'd seen before, this one had held its shape. The snow had drifted around it, sealing it like a fossil. They crouched close, photographing it, measuring. When compared against Jonah's known size, the print was smaller, narrower at the heel, shorter at the toe. Harlan logged the detailed boot impression size, inconsistent with subject preserved by drift. He bagged a cast, the plaster freezing almost solid before it set. The find shook the search team. If Jonah had not been alone, someone else had walked here. The question hung in the frozen air, unspoken but heavy. Whose boot, and why no other prints remained? By firelight that evening, stories began to slip from the older men. They spoke of Jonah's father, who decades earlier had clashed with hunters from the next settlement over a dispute about seal grounds that nearly came to blows. Some said Jonah had inherited that shadow, whether he wanted it or not. The old feud was like an unhealed wound, under ice, quiet until pressed, then bleeding out in silence. Younger volunteers listened in silence, the weight of history pressing down. Lena spread Jonah's map across her lap, placing the photograph of the boot print beside it. The circle seemed to draw everything into itself, the glove, the dragline now, this footprint. The map was tattered now, edges fraying from constant folding and unfolding. Its stains of grease and snow marked every hand that had touched it. She smoothed it flat and stared until the circle blurred. Night fell hard. Beyond the campfires, the island stretched silent, marked only by that single preserved step sealed in ice, as if meant to survive the storm when everything else had been erased. A single boot print sealed in ice like a fossil. By the 7th day, the RCMP considered scaling back the operation. Supplies were dwindling, and the official position tilted toward environmental disappearance. But the volunteers, especially Lena, refused. A smaller team assembled, riding back to the island, despite the cold biting sharper each hour. The machines rattled over drifts, their headlights cutting narrow tunnels of visibility. Lena rode in silence, the map pressed against her chest like a heartbeat. They retraced their steps through the tent rings, combing the ridges once more. Midday light fell slanted, and the snow reflected it in sheets so bright it hurt the eyes. Harland walked the line of rocks along a cliff face pole, tapping against stone when his boot struck something metal. He bent low, scraping ice away with gloved fingers, and pulled free a knife wedged in a crack. The blade gleamed faintly despite frost, but its handle was black and charred in a pattern too sharp to be weathered wood. He turned it in his hand. It was Jonah's knife, recognized instantly by Lena, who had seen it countless times on hunting trips. But it was altered. The blade was clean unstained, while the handle bore scorch marks curling deep into its grain. The smell of fuel lingered faint but distinct. Harlan logged the find, bagged the knife, and said nothing more. Around the campfire that evening, the knife lay on the map, its outline aligning almost perfectly with the penciled circle Jonah had drawn. Lena pressed it there, tracing the blade against the graphite. The image was unsettling steel shadowing Jonah's mark, as if his circle had been carved not with pencil, but with a weapon. The scorch marks raised questions none of them could answer. Fire on ice, fuel without flame. It was no ordinary campfire burn, and no one spoke aloud the possibility of deliberate destruction. Rumors thickened like frost. Some whispered the knife had been used, then burned to erase traces. Others muttered about Jonah stumbling into something larger than a personal feud. The silence from the land around them gave no confirmation, only the echo of their own voices against the ridges. Peter Kajak spoke last, his tone measured. He told of hunters in the past who carried messages not in words, but in objects left behind. A tool blackened, a map circled, a stone ring disturbed each, a signal to those who could read it. He lifted the knife, placed it back in its bag, and said, "He left us something. What it means is not for me to tell." That night, Lena lay awake, the oilcloth map under her head. The image of blade and circle burned into her mind. She wondered if Jonah had known his map would be found, if he had left it as a final instruction. The knife's handle still smelled faintly of chemicals, sharp and unnatural, as though the ice itself had absorbed it. Outside, the wind howled against the ridges, carrying the sound of something almost like voices, almost like warning. Blade blackened metal smelling faintly of fuel. The following days blurred together under constant wind, yet the search shifted tone. With the knife recovered, attention turned from ice hazards to motives, from weather to people. In the settlement, whispers grew louder. Jonah had always been meticulous, private, a man who carried his thoughts in silence. But silence does not mean absence. Someone mentioned that he often wrote late at night, filling a small notebook with quick, slanted words. A diary, perhaps. No one in his family had seen it since he disappeared. The idea of lost pages set fire to the search. Lena began asking quietly, moving through houses, listening for fragments. Weeks later, long after official efforts waned, a boy scavenging at the town dump found torn sheets clinging to a frostbitten plank. The paper was weathered, the graphite smeared, but the fragments bore Jonah's handwriting. Harland received them in a plastic envelope, his notes sparse, recovered dump. Potential subject material. One line was legible, pressed deep enough to cut the fiber's ice agreement. Another fragment ended mid-sentence, not the first to fall through. The words unsettled everyone who read them. Agreement suggested something formal, secret, perhaps binding. Fall through carried more than one meaning: ice, betrayal, failure. No date marked the scraps. They were context without anchor. Lena spread the fragments across Jonah's oilcloth map, pinning them with a fishing hook from his gear. The paper looked fragile against the grease-stained cloth, but the circle remained dark beneath them, the penciled graphite holding its ground. She read the lines again and again, until the words seemed to shift agreement with whom about what. The hook glinted in the lamplight like a nail driven through evidence. Searchers pressed deeper, though not into the ice. They began asking about surveyors who had come north in recent years, men mapping mineral routes under government contracts. Some recalled seeing Jonah in town with a stranger, weeks before, a man dressed not as a hunter, but as an outsider, clipboard in hand. No one knew his name, and no one admitted seeing him again. The fragments of paper hinted Jonah had known something perhaps too much. Harland, reading the scraps under fluorescent light in the detachment office, felt the weight of absence. Without full pages, context vanished. Yet the handwriting was Jonah's, confirmed by his sister. He noted it formally logged and sealed. The oilcloth map traveled back with Lena once more, the diary scraps now part of its surface story. Each night she unfolded it, staring at the overlapping layers: Jonah's circle, her penciled trail, the outline of his knife, the torn words pinned by steel. It was no longer just a map. It was a palimpsest of clues, of echoes, of silence. Outside the settlement, quieted under snow. Rumors grew louder only in private kitchens, where elders leaned close and whispered Jonah had walked into an agreement not meant for him. The torn phrase, not the first to fall through. The investigation entered a new stage, one that slipped from frozen landscapes into heated council chambers. Jonah's disappearance had become more than a family tragedy. It was an emblem pulled into long-standing disputes over hunting quotas and territorial rights. Each council meeting now carried the shadow of his name. Men leaned across tables, voices rising, old grudges surfacing like cracks in the ice. Official RCMP files, when later reviewed, showed an unease about pursuing these angles too deeply. Harlan's reports noted environmental risk, shifting current storms. Nowhere did they emphasize the diary fragments, the glove, or the boot print inconsistent with Jonah's size. Searchers, however, remembered differently. To them, the case carried the smell of unfinished business, of arguments that trailed beyond any one man. Lena continued her private investigation, unfolding Jonah's oilcloth map in her kitchen, smoothing the worn fabric under her hands. She marked new points in red pencil, each one corresponding to rumors of past disputes. The circle Jonah had drawn became the center of a triangle, its other corners marked by two strange details: the torn glove's coordinates and a set of numbers she had found buried in Harlan's notes, latitude and longitude, recorded from a radio ping. The logbook told the story plainly. At 4 p.m. on the day Jonah vanished, the RCMP had received a burst of static across their monitoring channel. The source was triangulated roughly 4 miles from where Jonah's snowmobile was later found. The signal was never answered, and the attempt to trace it was abandoned when storms forced retreat. Yet the detail was there, in ink: 4 p.m., 4 miles away, unacknowledged. For Lena, that log felt like Jonah's voice reaching across the white. She drew a triangle on his map, connecting the snowmobile site, the island circle, and the radio. Ping. It became a shape with no resolution, a geometry of silence. The more she looked, the more it seemed intentional, as if Jonah had been leaving coordinates, not by choice, but by necessity, like breadcrumbs across the ice. Elders shook their heads when she showed them. Some said triangles on the land were never good, a shape of imbalance, of unfinished paths. Others said it was coincidence, nothing more. Yet the image seared itself into Lena's thoughts. Council debates pressed harder, dredging up records of Jonah's father's disputes in the 1970s. A generation-old feud about seal hunting that had left wounds never healed. Families still carried the bitterness in small ways. Stares across tables, land use, questions left unresolved. Jonah's disappearance poured fuel back on those embers. Harland increasingly pressured minimize those tensions in his official writing. But among volunteers, the whispers grew stronger. Jonah had found himself caught between the ice and an old human fracture, one that still bled unseen beneath the snow. Night came heavy that day. Lena laid Jonah's map on the table, stared at the triangle she had drawn. At its center was only empty space. Radio ping recorded, but never answered. By the time 4 years had passed, Jonah's name was no longer spoken in daily conversation. His case file sat in the RCMP cabinet, slimmed by inaction, thick only with unanswered questions. Officially, his disappearance was labeled unsolved, presumed lost to environmental hazard. In town, however, the silence around him grew heavy, more suffocating than grief. Families spoke of him only in whispers or not at all. Then, in 2005, a hunter riding east of the inlet stumbled across something caught in a snowbank. At first he thought it was animal fur, wind-blown and snagged against stone. But when he pulled it free, it came apart in his hands, the lining of a parka frayed stiff with ice. He carried it back, reluctant, but compelled, and handed it over to Harland. Forensic checks later confirmed the fibers matched Jonah's coat. The stitching, though weathered, was distinctive, sewn by his own mother years before. But the find did not fit. The snowbank lay miles farther east than Jonah could have reached on his fuel load, even had he abandoned his machine at dawn. Harland wrote the note with care, item inconsistent with projected range. The contradiction sharpened the unease. If Jonah's parka lining was there, how had it traveled, carried, placed? Lena was called to identify it. She held the fabric for a long time, her hands trembling inside her mittens. The smell of age and frost clung to it, the texture both familiar and alien. She did not cry. She only nodded once quietly and laid it atop Jonah's oilcloth map. The fragment fluttered with the draft, a ghost tethered to paper. The map itself had aged. Its edges cracked now and folded, yellowing where candle soot had settled over years of being unrolled and studied. Yet the penciled circle still showed, though faint. When Lena placed the parka lining across it, the fit was uncanny, the fabric's shape echoing the curve of the graphite ring. She did not speak of this alignment, but she saw it, and it rooted itself deep. Rumors reignited. Some said the parka piece proved Jonah had been moved, perhaps dragged east beyond his own capacity. Others muttered darker ideas that someone had planted it to deflect or confuse. Searchers who once volunteered shook their heads, saying the land itself could play tricks, carrying items across miles and storms. Yet the straight line they remembered in the snow, the glove, the diary scraps, all of it leaned against that simple explanation. Council records show the find barely shifted the official stance. The file was updated, but no new search launched. Fuel costs were high, morale thin, and 4 years had drained any urgency from the authorities. The parka lining was sealed in evidence, logged, shelved. At her table, Lena unfolded the oilcloth one more time. The map's creases threatened to tear, but she spread it flat, placed the fabric scrap atop it. Her candle guttered in the draft, and the shadow of the cloth lay across the circle like a shroud. She leaned close, listening to the silence of her home. It felt as though Jonah was nearer than he had been in years, yet farther than ever to reach. Outside the snowbank, where the fragment had rested, still lay untouched wind, cutting across it with relentless force. The inlet swallowed sound, swallowed evidence, left only scraps fluttering against the stones. Fabric scrap fluttering against tundra stones. The years stretched on. Jonah's case became a cautionary tale whispered to children. Never ride out alone, never ignore the sky. Yet for Lena, the silence pressed sharper with each winter. By 2015, most of the volunteers who had combed the ice had grown old, their memories blurred, but the story refused to rest. It stirred again when a younger generation began rooting through archives, chasing echoes with fresh eyes. One discovery changed the weight of it all. In a locked drawer of the RCMP office, sealed under layers of dust, lay a photograph taken just days before Jonah vanished. It was a casual frame, almost careless, but it cut like a blade when unfolded. Jonah stood on the ice beside a man no one recognized. The stranger wore a heavy parka hood, half-drawn face angled away from the camera. At their feet lay the oilcloth map, fully unfolded across the snow. The penciled circle was visible dark, even in the faded print. The timestamp at the bottom corner read 11:45. 2 days before Jonah left. Harland, now long retired, claimed no memory of the photo, though his handwriting marked the envelope. No record showed why it had been taken or by whom. The existence of an unknown man pulled the case into a darker dimension. This was no longer only about weather or old feuds. Someone else had stood with Jonah sharing that map before the disappearance. When Lena first saw it, her knees nearly buckled. She spread the photo across her brother's map, sliding it inside the folds. The effect was haunting. Image and object layered Jonah's living face against his own pencil marks. The stranger's turned head offered nothing. No identity, no clarity. Only the suggestion of another hand in the story, erased by time and silence. Whispers spread fast. Some said the man was a government surveyor charting mineral paths across the inlet. Others claimed he was tied to older family disputes. A cousin from another settlement returned to press his claim. Still others suggested the photograph itself was staged, planted long after to confuse. The town split into hushed arguments, no side, with proof each convinced the other was blind. For Lena, the photograph brought no peace. It only deepened the ache. Jonah had not been alone. That truth was both anchor and torment. She pinned the image inside the oilcloth map, folding them together so that one could never be separated from the other. It was the closest she had come to holding her brother again. His face, his mark, his silence. The elders gathered one evening to study the photo under dim light. Peter Kajak stared long, his eyes narrowed. "Two men," he whispered, but one turned away. "That is the way with secrets?" He would not elaborate further, only shook his head. The photo passed from hand to hand, each pause a question unsaid. When it returned to Lena, she tucked it against her chest and left without another word. The oilcloth map was now no longer a guide, but a reliquary, a vessel of images and artifacts that refused to let Jonah rest. The photograph lingered in minds long after an image, with no explanation, only the certainty of absence. Two men in frame, one face turned from the lens. 2 decades had passed, yet Jonah's absence had never thinned. The inlet still bore his name in whispers, the island still carried his circle, and his family still gathered each winter to remember the man who never returned. In 2021, the council finally decided to move Jonah's artifacts into the community archive. There under glass, his oilcloth map was flattened and preserved. The fabric had grown brittle, its edges cracked and yellowed, but the pencil circle remained dark against the faded lines. It became not only an artifact of a disappearance, but a testament to what lingered unresolved. The map was displayed beside the torn diary fragments, the parka lining, and the photograph discovered years later. Visitors leaned close, tracing the overlap of objects without touching. Children asked why the map mattered, and elders told them it carried more than a root, it carried a silence no one could break. For Lena, the archive offered no comfort. She visited often, sitting before the glass for hours, her reflection mingling with Jonah's circle. The image of him with the unnamed man haunted her. She believed the stranger held the missing answer, whether tied to old disputes over hunting grounds or to new forces pressing into the land. But the photograph gave no name, no direction, only the angle of a face turned away. The RCMP case file remained marked unsolved. The logbook still listed the snowmobile found upright, the engine warm, the key absent. The glove too small. The boot print not Jonah's, the scorch marks on the knife. The diary fragments hinting at an agreement, the radio ping unanswered at 4 p.m. Each detail preserved, each detail incapable of closing the gap. Around kitchen tables, people still argued in murmurs. Some insisted Jonah had walked into old family feuds that never ended. Others believed he stumbled onto something larger, perhaps tied to outsiders whose interests lay hidden beneath the ice. No theory carried proof. The inlet had swallowed it all. On quiet nights, Lena would return home, close her eyes, and still feel the weight of the map against her chest as it had been in those first days of searching. The oilcloth was gone from her hands now, but in memory, it still folded and unfolded endlessly, its circle pressing dark into her skin. The story remained unfinished, like a trail vanishing into white. Jonah's snowmobile, his map, his silence, each fragment preserved, yet none giving closure. The family, the searchers, the community each held a piece, but together they formed only a shape of absence. In the archive, under steady light, the oilcloth map lay quiet. The circle Jonah had drawn remained the pencil line still dark with his hand. Map under glass circle, still dark with his hand.